Imagine a coin so trustworthy that for 7 centuries, across 3 continents, it was accepted without question, not because of the face stamped upon it, but because of an unshakable idea it represented. This is the story of the Byzantine Bezant, a piece of gold that became the world's first true global currency. Its journey, from the forges of a crumbling empire to the palm of a Viking trader a world away, reveals a secret far more profound than the glitter of precious metal. It shows us that money is, at its heart, a psychological construct, a shared fiction, a fragile story of value that an entire civilization told so convincingly and with such unwavering consistency that the world chose to believe it for generations. The rise and fall of this golden disc is not merely a numismatic curiosity. It is a masterclass in the architecture of trust and meditation on how societies build the invisible pillars that support their wealth and what happens when those pillars slowly and inexorably begin to crack. Our story begins not with stability, but with profound, systemic chaos. In the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire was caught in a spiral often called the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a period where the very foundations of the Roman world seemed to liquefy. Emperors rose and fell with violent rapidity, proclaimed by legions on distant frontiers more often than by senatorial decree in Rome. Barbarian incursions pierced the borders, and a plague swept through the population. But perhaps the most insidious and culturally corrosive crisis was economic. The currency of the realm, the silver Antoninianus, had become an instrument of betrayal. Faced with endless military demands and shrinking tax bases, emperors resorted to a desperate, hidden trick. They would take the silver coin and, while keeping its official denomination and size, secretly reduce its precious metal content, alloying it with cheaper copper or bronze. Then, they would mint these debased coins in vast, inflationary quantities. The psychological impact of this debasement was devastating. Imagine you are a baker in a provincial town. A soldier pays you with a coin that bears the emperor's portrait and is stamped with a promise of value. You accept it, only to learn later that merchants in the next town, or a savvy money changer, values it at half what you thought because its silver content has been secretly hollowed out. Your labor has been stolen, not by a thief in the night, but by the distant state that issued the token. This repeated, systematic deception eroded the fundamental contract between citizen and empire. Money is a promise that this token will be accepted by others for roughly equivalent value. When that promise is continually broken, trust evaporates. Prices skyrocketed in a frantic, unmoored dance, an ancient hyperinflation. Barter reemerged as people retreated from a corrupted monetary system. The complex, interconnected economy of the Mediterranean world, which relied on efficient medium of exchange, began to seize up. The glue was dissolving. The first major attempt at a cure was not monetary, but authoritarian. Emperor Diocletian, in 301 AD, issued his famous edict on maximum prices. It was a staggering document, a breathtaking attempt to command economic reality through sheer imperial will. It listed maximum prices for over 1,000 goods and services, from a day's wages for a farm labor to the cost of a single Egyptian lettuce. The psychology behind it was rooted in a moral view of economics. The crisis was seen as one of greed and profiteering, a failure of social order that could be corrected by legislative fiat. The edict proclaimed that the chaos was the work of uncontrolled madness and sought to restore stability by decree. It failed utterly. Goods vanished from official markets. Hidden transactions flourished, and the fundamental problem, a worthless and untrustworthy medium of exchange, remained untouched. Diocletian's edict stands as a monumental lesson. You cannot legislate value into existence. You cannot command trust. It must be cultivated, earned, and meticulously maintained. The true solution arrived with Constantine the Great, and it was elegant in its simplicity and radical in its implications. In the early 4th century, as he consolidated his rule, Constantine introduced a new coin, the solidus. Its innovation was not in its design, but in its substance. It was a coin of pure, reliable gold, struck at 72 to the Roman pound. Each solidus contained approximately 4.5 grams of fine gold, and this standard was enforced with unwavering strictness. This was a profound strategic gamble. By rigidly tethering the empire's primary currency to a tangible, scarce commodity, Constantine voluntarily shackled the state's short-term fiscal flexibility. In a sudden emergency, a war, a famine, a rebellion, he could no longer simply mint more money to pay his bills. He had tied the state's solvency directly to its physical reserves of gold. But the trade-off was a masterpiece of long-term thinking. He was purchasing something far more valuable than temporary liquidity. He was buying irrevocable credibility. The message of the solidus was unambiguous, tangible, and instantly verifiable. Its weight was its value. Its purity was its promise. This was more than a return to a primitive gold standard. It was the deliberate fusion of precious metal with the resurrected authority of a state pledging to uphold its own integrity. The psychological shift for the user was profound. The exhausting calculation of trust, "Can I believe what this coin claims to be?" was replaced by immediate, visceral acceptance. The coin felt solid, permanent, and real. It was an anchor in a turbulent world. To appreciate the crossroad at which Constantine stood, we can glance at his rivals. To the east, the Sasanian Empire of Persia minted its own magnificent gold dinar, a symbol of the Shahanshah's glory and divine favor. It was prestigious and widely accepted. But the Byzantine approach, which would evolve from Constantine's reform, aimed for something beyond prestige. It aimed for impersonal, systemic reliability. The Roman system was being rebuilt not merely on military might or administrative control, but on a bedrock of economic faith. This choice echoes a timeless dilemma of governance: the seductive ease of the short-term fix versus the arduous, disciplined cultivation of long-term stability. Constantine planted the acorn of trust, and from it would grow an oak whose branches would one day span the known world. So, the coin was forged. But a coin in an imperial vault is inert, a symbol without function. The critical question then becomes one of mechanics and metaphysics. How does this physical object transform into a living, breathing system of trust? How does it travel from the high-security workshops of Constantinople across the choppy waters of the Mediterranean into the bustling markets of Alexandria, and from there, perhaps wrapped in felt and leather, find its way into the treasure chest of a Norse chieftain on a foggy Scandinavian fjord? The answer lies in the brilliant, interlocking machine that was the Byzantine Empire itself. The Bezant, the name given to the solidus in the Latin West, was not merely a coin. It was the gleaming output of a sophisticated, self-reinforcing triad of power. This triad fused unyielding metallurgical consistency, a pervasive imperial bureaucracy, and a deep, resonant theological ideology. First, consider the mint. This was no humble artisan's workshop. It was a high-security state factory, a fortress of finance often located within the Great Palace complex itself. The process was a meticulously choreographed sequence designed to eliminate error and fraud. It began with the Kammerkarioi, imperial officials who served as tax collectors and commercial regulators. Crucially, they often gathered state dues not in kind, not in wheat or olives, but in raw gold bullion. This systematic channeling of precious metal into the state's coffers was the first step in a closed-loop system. The gold flowed to the capital, where it underwent rigorous assaying. Then, the moneyers, state servants operating under severe penalties for any deviation, struck each coin. The consistency they achieved over centuries is staggering to modern metallurgists. For 700 years, the gold content of the Bezant rarely wavered beyond a tolerance of 1 or 2%. This was pre-industrial mass production with a precision that created not just currency, but perfectly interchangeable units of trust. A Bezant from the reign of Justinian in the 6th century and one from Basil II in the 11th were, for all practical purposes, identical. This eliminated a fundamental transaction cost of ancient trade: the need for verification. You did not need to bite it, ring it, or test it on a touchstone. Its consistency was its legend, and the legend was true. Yet, a system based solely on bureaucratic efficiency is cold and vulnerable. It needs a story, a soul, a reason to believe that transcends ledgers and balances. This is where Byzantine genius infused the monetary metal with divine meaning. The iconography on the coin evolved powerfully over time. Early Bezants bore the stern, armored profile of the emperor, a traditional symbol of worldly, secular power. But as Christianity became the empire's bedrock, the coin's message deepened. Emperors began to be depicted receiving blessings from Christ or being crowned by the Virgin Mary. The coin became a narrative of divine endorsement. Then, in a final, profound step, the coin itself became a portable icon. The image of Christ Pantocrator, Christ the Almighty, the ruler of all, gazed out from the gold. Now, the bezant was more than an imperial promise. It was a tangible fragment of a cosmic, Christian-ordained order. It whispered that the stability of New Rome, the Byzantine state, was underwritten by heaven itself. To accept, use, or hoard a bezant was to participate in that sacred order. This fusion of finance and faith was a psychological masterstroke. It anchored the trust required for the currency in something perceived as eternal and unchanging, far beyond the lifespan of any single emperor or dynasty. It elevated the coin from the realm of economics to the realm of belief. Observing the human behavior that this system enabled reveals the sheer scale of its power. Consider the Mediterranean merchant, a Syrian trader perhaps, arriving in the port of Carthage or Marseille. In his pouch are bezants from Constantinople. He wishes to purchase a cargo of Gallic wool. The local merchant has never met him, knows nothing of his reputation, and certainly cannot vouch for the integrity of his distant emperor. In a world of countless local coinages and rampant debasement, such a transaction would normally require a trusted intermediary, a money changer to assay the foreign coins, and a hefty discount for the risk. But with bezants, this friction vanished. The brand was so powerful, the systemic trust so complete, that the coins were accepted at face value, sight unseen. They eliminated the cognitive and transactional cost of doubt. For the Byzantine state, the system created a potent, direct link with its military. Soldiers, from the elite tagmata of the capital to the frontier guards in Armenia, were paid in reliable gold bezants. This meant their loyalty was monetized in the most stable terms imaginable. A Varangian guardsman from Sweden knew that the gold he earned in Constantinople could be carried home and recognized as immense wealth, or traded anywhere along the route. His service was tethered directly to the most trustworthy store of value on the planet. Even those outside the empire, often hostile to it, paid the bezant the ultimate compliment: imitation. Barbarian kings across Europe, from the Lombards in Italy to Offa of Mercia in England, produced their own crude copies. These coins, often lightweight and poorly struck, were a form of flattery and a silent admission. They revealed that these rulers understood the symbolic power of the coin but lacked the immense, sophisticated apparatus, the mints, the bullion supply, the bureaucratic integrity, the overarching narrative that made the original so powerful. To grasp the bezant's uniqueness, we must contrast it with the economic reality developing in the post-Roman West. There, the feudal system was crystallizing, an economy based fundamentally on land and personal obligation. Wealth was measured in acres, in peasants, in castles. Transactions were often in kind. So many days of labor owed to a lord in exchange for protection and the right to farm a strip of land. Taxes, where they existed, were frequently paid in goods: chickens, bushels of wheat, lengths of cloth. This was a localized, dematerialized economy. The Byzantine system, however, was hypermonetized and fiercely centralized. Taxes were demanded in gold, the army was paid in gold, and the state's authority was exercised through its monopoly on the production and distribution of this gold. It was a financial engine of unparalleled sophistication for its time. In a conceptual sense, the bezant's consistent stamp functioned like a primitive physical blockchain, a verifiable tamper-proof record, the imperial imprint, that guaranteed its provenance and purity, creating trust between two parties without their need for a personal relationship or a third-party verifier in that moment. The system was a masterpiece, perfectly calibrated for centuries. But herein lay the latent peril. A system engineered for perfect internal consistency exists within a messy, unpredictable, and changing world. The bezant's greatest strength, its universal acceptability, would become the very conduit for pressures that would, over generations, strain the system to its breaking point. At the peak of its influence, the bezant was the indispensable, silent partner in every major trade route on the globe. It was the dollar, the euro, and the yen of the medieval world, all in one. It traveled east along the Silk Road, through the caravan cities of Aleppo and Samarkand, all the way to the court of Tang China, where it was known and admired as Manjing, constant gold. It moved north and west, up the rivers of Rus, carried by Viking merchants and warriors who called it the gold of the Greeks, found in hordes from Stockholm to Suffolk. It sailed on Arab dhows across the Indian Ocean to the spice ports of India and beyond. Byzantium, sitting astride the Bosporus, was the nexus. Its economic model during this period is fascinating to modern economists. The empire ran a persistent, structural trade deficit. Luxuries, Chinese silks, Indian spices, Persian jewels, Egyptian papyrus, flowed into Constantinople in a shimmering stream. And in return, Bezants flowed out. This was sustainable for a remarkably long time, because Byzantium wasn't just exporting gold, it was exporting monetary stability. The world was willing to pay a premium in real goods and services to use its impeccable, trustworthy currency. The empire collected a kind of seigniorage on a global scale. The psychological state this bred within the Byzantine ruling and bureaucratic classes was one of dangerous, perhaps inevitable, complacency. After 10, 15, 20 generations of unbroken stability, the system ceased to be seen as a brilliant, hard-won achievement. It became perceived as a natural law, as permanent and unchanging as the seasons or the tides. The very idea of debasing the Bezant was not just economically unwise. It was culturally and almost theologically unthinkable, a rupture in the divine and earthly order. This invincibility bias is a common cognitive trap for long-dominant institutions, from empires to corporations. It breeds a rigidity, a blindness to slow-creeping vulnerabilities, a belief that the past is a perfect blueprint for the future. Meanwhile, the behavior of external actors began to shift in subtle but draining ways. Other polities, particularly the rising Islamic Caliphate after the 7th century and the ambitious Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa from the 10th century onward, grew sophisticated in their understanding of the Bezant's power. They didn't just passively accept it in trade. They began to actively demand it in treaties, as tribute, or as the stipulated currency for large contracts. The Caliphate, even as it minted its own excellent gold dinar, often hoarded Bezants as strategic reserves. Venice, in its commercial treaties with the empire, negotiated terms that funneled Bezants into its coffers. This was a deliberate, strategic accumulation that slowly siphoned the empire's lifeblood, its gold stock, outward. Internally, a parallel corrosion was at work. The Byzantine elite, the great landowning families, the powerful aristocracy, increasingly used their influence to secure exemptions from taxation. They built vast, self-sufficient estates where wealth was hoarded in vaults, in the form of course, Bezants. This internal hoarding took the coins out of circulation, starving the state of the recyclable bullion it needed to mint new coins to pay its soldiers and bureaucrats. The state's fiscal spine was being weakened from within, even as external pressures mounted. The endless, costly wars on eastern frontiers with Persians and later Arabs. The catastrophic military defeat at Manzikert in 1071, which opened Anatolia to Turkish invasion. The rising cost of relying on expensive foreign mercenaries. Emperors found themselves trapped in the classic, brutal dilemma of monetary history. Debase the currency to create short-term fiscal space for survival, or maintain metallic purity and risk immediate military and political collapse. This period also highlights a fascinating cross-cultural monetary rivalry. From the 7th century onward, the Islamic world issued its own gold coin, the dinar. Modeled initially on the Bezant, it quickly established its own high standards of purity and weight, backed by the authority of the caliph and the principles of Sharia law, which contained specific injunctions against fraud and debasement. For centuries, the Bezant and the dinar circulated side by side, often mutually accepted across religious frontiers. It was a kind of monetary Cold War, a contest between two sophisticated systems of trust. The existence of a credible, stable rival was itself a new factor for Byzantium. It meant that trust, if broken, could now migrate. Merchants had an alternative. The parallels to modern global finance are irresistible and instructive. The Bezant's role in the medieval economy bears a striking resemblance to the U.S. dollar's role in the post-Bretton Woods world. Both enjoyed an exorbitant privilege as the global reserve currency. Both saw external, constant demand that conferred immense power but also created profound vulnerabilities, tying domestic policy to global expectations. The Byzantine Empire, much like the modern Federal Reserve, had to manage its currency not just for its domestic economy, but with an eye to its function as the linchpin of world trade. Then came the fateful, psychological Rubicon. In the mid-11th century, under Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos and more decisively under his successors, the unthinkable was thought and then acted upon. Faced with a dire fiscal crisis following the disaster at Manzikert, the imperial mint reduced the gold content of the histamenon numisma, the standard bezant. It was not a dramatic collapse at first, perhaps a small percentage of gold replaced with silver. It may have been seen as a temporary, technical adjustment, a necessary fudge to meet a payroll or hire mercenaries. But in the psychology of money, this was a seismic event. The 700-year promise, the covenant of purity, had been broken. The spell of inviolability was shattered. Once the precedent was set, the path of least resistance beckoned. What followed was not a sudden crash, but a slow-motion unraveling, a masterclass in the erosion of trust that played out over the next 3 centuries. The debasement was a creeping, tragic process, and the coin itself became its own diary of decline. The classic bezant was a flat, solid, heavy disk of gold. The new coin, introduced in the late 11th century, was the trachea. It was thinner, and most distinctively, it was concave, shaped like a shallow cup or a saucer. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was a physical admission. The cup shape allowed a thinner, broader coin to retain some structural rigidity while using less metal. It felt different, flimsy, insubstantial. As the decades passed, the gold content of the trachea steadily dwindled, replaced by increasing amounts of silver, then copper. The color changed from a deep, sun-like yellow to a pale, sickly electrum, and finally to a base, coppery hue. You could see and feel the empire's desperation in the palm of your hand. With this physical decay came the inevitable economic and psychological consequences. As people, merchants, soldiers, peasants, noticed the decline, a principle later named Gresham's Law took powerful hold. Sir Thomas Gresham, a 16th-century English financier, observed that bad money drives out good. When 2 forms of coinage are in circulation, but one is intrinsically more valuable, the older, pure bezants, and the other less so, the new, debased trachees, people will hoard, melt down, or export the good money and pass on the bad money as quickly as possible. The good bezants vanished into private hoards, were smuggled abroad, or were clipped for their residual gold. The debased coins flooded the marketplace. Merchants, sensing the decay, began to discount them. They might demand 2, then 3, then 4 trachees for a transaction that once cost a single bezant. The network effect that had propelled the bezant to global glory, where its acceptance bred more acceptance, now viciously reversed. Distrust bred more distrust. Devaluation prompted hoarding, which prompted further devaluation. Human behavior adapted with cold, rational precision. The Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, whose economic power was now ascendant, began to lose faith. They started to insist on payment in their own, more reliable silver grossi or in the still pure Islamic gold dinars. They began to write contracts in these alternative currencies. Trust was migrating, following credibility. The final, catastrophic blow to the bezant, however, was not purely economic. It was symbolic, psychological, and spiritual. In 1204, an event of almost unimaginable sacrilege occurred. The armies of the Fourth Crusade, diverted from their aim of reaching Jerusalem and deeply in debt to their Venetian financiers, turned on Christian Constantinople itself. They breached the legendary Theodosian walls, not as liberators, but as looters. For 3 days, they sacked the greatest city of Christendom. They stripped the altars of Hagia Sophia, smashed holy relics, seized unimaginable treasures, and installed a prostitute on the patriarch's throne in a grotesque mockery. They did not just steal gold, they shattered the narrative. The eternal city, the new Rome, the God-protected throne that had backed the coin for centuries, was revealed to be naked, vulnerable, and mortal. If God had withdrawn his protection from the empire, could his image still sanctify its currency? The sack of 1204 was a death knell for the Byzantine state as a great power, and it fatally wounded the aura of the Bezant. The coin, now debased and stripped of its ideological armor, continued to circulate in ever-worsening form for another 2 centuries, a pathetic ghost of its former self, until the empire's final, whimpering end with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Yet, in a profound and telling twist, the idea of the Bezant, its ghost, outlived the physical coin and the empire that created it. Its spectral presence haunted European finance for centuries. In the account books of medieval merchants and the treatises of Renaissance scholars, Bezant remained a generic term for gold coinage, a unit of account, a standard of value to aspire to. The quest for a perfectly stable, universal store of value, a numeraire that could transcend politics and time, became the holy grail of economic thought. We can see the Bezant's direct echo in the classical gold standard of the 19th and early 20th centuries, a concerted, global effort to recapture that tangible certainty, to anchor paper promises to a physical, glittering reality. But that system, for all its sophistication, lasted barely a century before fragmenting under the cataclysmic strains of World War and Depression. The Bretton Woods system that followed, which tied the world's currencies to the U.S. dollar, itself tied to gold, was even more ephemeral, lasting roughly 50 years. This comparison forces upon us a humbling, awe-inspiring question. What did the Byzantines understand or achieve that allowed their system to endure for 700 years, an order of magnitude longer than any modern analog? Their longevity suggests that monetary stability requires something more profound than a metal standard or a clever set of policy rules. It requires a deep, culturally embedded narrative, a story that binds the trust of individuals across generations, fusing the material with the metaphysical, the fiscal with the philosophical, into a seamless, believable whole. The agonizing, slow-motion management of debasement by later Byzantine emperors finds its direct echo in the modern battles fought by central banks. Their high-stakes drama of raising or lowering interest rates, their forward guidance, and quantitative easing are all sophisticated tools in the same ancient struggle, the battle to maintain public belief in the value of the currency during times of stress. The core challenge is identical across the millennia: how to maintain the credibility of the story, the narrative of value, when external shocks and internal pressures threaten to expose its fictional nature. The tools have evolved from minting techniques to digital spreadsheets, but the psychological battlefield remains the same. As we conclude, let us hold 2 coins in our mind's eye. One is a pristine 6th century Bezant from the reign of Justinian. It is heavy, its gold a deep and unwavering yellow, the image of the emperor or of Christ Pantocrator struck with crisp, confident authority. It is an object of beauty and immense power. The other is a battered, pale 14th century trachea. It is thin, concave, its design blurred, its metal a washed-out mixture of silver and copper. It feels cheap, a token of despair. We are not just looking at 2 coins. We are looking at the birth and death of a belief system. We are witnessing the life cycle of trust, made manifest in metal. What died was a specific, magnificent, and historically unique institutional embodiment of trust. What lives on, however, is the eternal, human quest for a Bezant of the mind, a perfect, trustworthy token of value in which we can have absolute faith. We see this ancient quest burning brightly in our own digital age. It fuels the cryptographic promises of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, which seek to generate trust through decentralized, transparent code and mathematical scarcity, removing the fallible human institution from the equation. Simultaneously, it drives the development of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which seek to modernize trust through digitized, state-backed authority, hoping to combine the efficiency of the digital with the credibility of the sovereign. The mediums change, from hammer-struck gold to blockchain entries to central bank servers, but the fundamental human longing remains constant: a search for a stable, reliable place to anchor our labor, our savings, and our dreams for the future. The ultimate lesson of the Bezant, therefore, transcends economics or history. It is a lesson about storytelling. Value is not a physical fact inherent in a piece of metal, a slip of paper, or a string of code. It is a shared fiction, a story we all agree to believe, and more importantly, to act upon. for as long as the narrative holds. The Byzantines crafted a story of divine order, imperial permanence, and meticulous, unwavering integrity. They told this story not just in parchment and liturgy, but in the most powerful medium of all, in the gold that passed through every hand, in every market, for every transaction. They told it with such consistency, for so long, that the world accepted their coin not as a piece of metal, but as a piece of that story. They understood, intuitively, that the most powerful currency is never minted in a palace alone. It is forged in the collective human mind. For 700 years, they maintained that fragile, miraculous consensus. Their coin ruled the world not by force of arms, but by force of belief. And in its long, quiet reign, it offers us a timeless truth. In the end, all money is faith, and all finance is, ultimately, a matter of psychology.